Hey everybody, Sean from Media Assault here, and it's time once again for another movie review. This time out I'm going to take a look at the documentary Men in Suits, and this was written and directed by Frank H. Woodward, and it's a look at men in suits. Not suits like suit and tie, but suits like monster suits, or gorilla suits, or Godzilla suits, the kaiju films from Japan. This is a look behind the scenes and behind the masks, or behind the suits, if you will, of the guys who play the monsters and creatures in movies that require somebody to get into a suit to do the portrayal of these characters and creatures. As you know, one of the things that really is not one of my favorite things is CGI. I love practical effects, and I am a big fan of kaiju films. I'm also a big fan of the giant ape movies, King Kong, Mighty Joe Young, Son of Kong, things like that. Well, the original King Kong movies were done with stop motion, not CGI, and not men in suits. The Godzilla films, the kaiju films, of course, were done with men in suits. But there are other areas that you kind of forget that there are people in suits acting. And that would be like the old gorilla films of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, like The Ape, or trying to think of some of the other titles, and they're escaping me now. But they are featured in the documentary. But even now, there are people who wear suits. Doug Jones as Abe Sapien in the Hellboy movies, or Fauno in Pan's Labyrinth. He is interviewed for this film. Tom Woodruff Jr., who played the alien, or aliens, in Alien 3 or Alien Resurrection, of course, the Alien versus Predator movies. He's interviewed, he's talked to in this documentary. Brian Steele, who also played the Predator, not the original Predator in the first movie, but in the more recent Predators, and I believe in the Alien versus Predator movies, maybe not, but I know he did play the Berserker Predator, for example, in the Predators films. Also, of course, the great Haru Nakajima, who played Godzilla. He is interviewed in this film, and he kind of goes over some of the trials and tribulations of the original Godzilla suit, the fact that it weighed 220 pounds, and the fact that I believe they could only wear the suit, him and another gentleman who's not interviewed in the film, but who also played Godzilla, they could only wear the suit for 5 to 10 minutes before they'd actually pass out. Bob Burns, who was mostly known, at least by me, as Tracy the gorilla in the Ghostbusters, not the real Ghostbusters cartoon, but there was a live action show called The Ghostbusters, which featured Forrest Tucker and Larry Storch, and he was their gorilla sidekick. He wore a little beanie on his head. He's interviewed, and he kind of documents sort of the rise and evolution of gorilla suits up through the 30s, 40s, 50s, up to when he started. Misty Rosas, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She played Amy the gorilla in Congo, and she talks about not only her work on the Congo film and behind the mask and the suit of doing the ape performance, but she also does sort of an offshoot of suit performing, which is motion capture. She's on she does work on Sid the Science Kid, which is on PBS, which is a computer animated series, but it requires motion capture, so she has to wear a suit with the little balls on it that the infrared cameras track her motions and her movements, and it produces a live render of these actions. It's kind of an interesting overlap of suit performing and CGI. And then Van Snowden, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was a member of the Croft Empire as a suit performer. He played H.R. Puffenstuff in some of the later productions, like a TV movie, but he also did Tweeter in The Bugaloos, and he was in Sigmund and the Sea Monsters as Sweet Mama Ooze and Dr. Cyclops. He kind of talks about working on the Croft shows and the way that those shows were put together, and how just how his performance was altered by the suit, and it's very interesting. The movie goes into great detail, not only of just the physical demands of being in these suits, which are incredibly draining because they're heavy and they cause the actors to sweat a lot, and just because you've got to work 10 to 12 to 18-hour days in these things, and you've got to be incredibly physically fit to wear them. But it also talks about the sort of second-class citizenship, if you will, of the actors in the suits who are not necessarily always thought of as actors. And they talk about sort of how they were first thought of as sort of props on the set because, the directors and producers and whatnot couldn't see the actual person, so they didn't really think of them as people. So they used to ask them to do all sorts of crazy things and put a lot of physical demands on them that they wouldn't do an ordinary actor. But then it talks about how they were recognized as being actors for a while, and then somewhere in the early 2000s, or maybe it was 95, I think, somewhere between the mid-90s and the 2000s, they were sort of replaced by stuntmen. They figured, I guess, to cut corners and cut costs rather than trying to get somebody who would ask for a higher salary because they were thinking of themselves as actors. The studios would just use stunt people in these suits, and the actors interviewed in this film think that the performances were not as good or as nuanced as they could have been had they gone the actor route. They talk about the technical limitations of what they can, technical and physical limitations of what they can and can't do while wearing the suits. Their sight is sort of hampered. Their physical movements are hampered because they can't raise their arms above their heads or whatnot. Or in some cases, like some of the Jim Henson creatures, like Sweetums, you'd have what's called a dead hand, where one arm is pinned to the chest or is immobile basically, so the performer's other hand can be used to move the mouth, stuff like that. And then they talk about sort of the rise of CGI, how when Jurassic Park came out, that most of the actors that do the suit work were thought of themselves as they were going to be permanently unemployed. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, you saw a lot of all CGI productions, but then sort of in the middle of the 2000s, you got to see the suits come back, but they were enhanced with CGI, and they think that's probably the way that it should be because it leads to a more believable performance with the actors who are interacting with the people in the suits. And of course, because there's something physical there, it just looks more believable than the composite shot of CGI being put in the scene. There's also a walkthrough sort of that you get an idea of how these things are put together, and it's done with an actor named Douglas Tate, who is playing a character called Abominog in the upcoming movie Knights of Badassdom, which has kind of been delayed because it was produced, I believe, in 2010, or it was filming in 2010, but it hasn't been released yet. But you get to see the creation of the suit, the actor trying it on for the first time, suggesting improvements, and then coming in later while it's been sort of improved, working on that a little bit, and then you see the final design, and he walks around in the studio, and you see the remote control people doing the eyes and the mouth and the tongue and everything. And then you get to see him on set and film a couple scenes, and it's just a nice way to show how these things come from idea to actual creation and how they're put into play, while he's giving you sort of examples of the trials and tribulations of going through that process. It's very cool. The film gives you a really nice insight into the actors' feelings, what they have to go through on a day-to-day basis. Guillermo del Toro is interviewed, and he talks about what he would and wouldn't ask of a performer, but basically because he knows somebody like Doug Jones, who he's worked with on Hellboy and Pan's Labyrinth, that the actors don't necessarily complain, even though they know that they're being injured by the suit and whatnot. So he says he knows that Doug is being injured when he's either crying or bleeding because he won't complain, and he knows that's when he knows to stop what he's doing. The main bonus to this film, I think the film's draw, is the fact that you finally get to hear from the performers that are in the suits and hear their side of the story, because somebody always interviews the director or always interviews the writer or always interviews the headline stars, and they never talk to the people who are actually doing the creature work, or playing the villains or whatever, the people in the suits. And this is an interesting perspective on some of the films that you may know and love from the guys who played the creatures, or people talking about the guys who played the creatures. So if you're interested in movies like Godzilla, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Hellboy, Pan's Labyrinth, Alien, any of those types of films, and you want to learn a little bit more about them, this is a good place to start. And the movie's called Men in Suits. It's available directly on DVD. It never came out on cable or was released into theaters as far as I know. I got my copy from Amazon.com. It's actually released by the studio directly. It is Weird Studios. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's WYRD, or it's either Weird or Wired. I'm not really sure. But their website is WYRDSTUFF.com, weirdstuff.com. And there's the back of the DVD. So anyway, as far as a rating goes, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I think it's really informative. It didn't go quite as in-depth as I would have liked it to, but then again, I'm a little more familiar with some of the stuff, so I want to get into the meat, and I think this is more geared toward people who are just first learning about stuff like this. So for that, I would recommend it highly, and I think you should check it out. So there you go. That's my review of Men in Suits. As always, feel free to rate, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and take it easy.